Thank you all very much for being here today. I want to start with that. And then I also want to explain my funny shirt. I got a lot of double takes when people came in today. And I want to explain that this was my father's shirt. And I'm wearing it today as a sort of small and maybe somewhat insignificant but colorful little symbol of the imprint that he left on my life. So we've gathered here today to reflect on the life of Robert Lee Rogers. He was a husband and a father. He was a soldier and a worker. He was a simple man who deferred gratification and respected others. He did the best he could. That's about the sum of it, in a nutshell, as Dad would always say, in a nutshell. And he need not be idolized or enlarged today in death beyond what he was in life. We should really remember him simply and plainly, because that's what he would have wanted. My dad was a decent and tolerant man. He was one who worked hard, and he loved his family and his wife, and he loved his country. He was a man who made a difference. Jackie Robinson once said that the measure of a person's life can be directly correlated to the proportion in which it impacts other lives. I think that's right. My dad didn't impact the most lives in the world, but those that he did impact, he made a tremendous difference in. We were profoundly touched by the life that he lived. He was one man who did the best he could with what he had. He was my working class hero. And like all men who carry a quiet, unassuming dignity and resolve, he was not always fully appreciated in his time, not even by me. To tell a little story, when I was a boy, I attended a nice, well-supplied school not far from where we are today. It was worlds apart from the long-since demolished buildings where my dad went to school in Los Angeles in the 1930s. He used to run around the track there barefoot during his PE class without shoes until his soles were bloody because his father couldn't afford to buy him any. Of course, my only memory of school shoes was how me and the other kids in the playground would walk around with our new Jordans or whatever was the sort of in vogue high-priced shoe of the day. We never wanted for anything. My dad was enduring so much, and yet he provided so plentifully. Yet amazingly, there was a time when I was ashamed of him. He was a kind and mild man, quietly sacrificing so that I could have the advantages he never had. But he was a lot different from the other fathers that I saw when I was growing up. He wasn't young or fast-talking or well-connected. He was old and leathery and seemingly incapable of superficial chatter. While my friends' dads would wear smart clothes and drive late-model cars, my father sputtered along in that lumbering, exhaust-belching truck with his rumpled work clothes and his unruly gray hair. I would shudder with embarrassment in elementary school when I would find out on those few occasions that Dad would be coming to pick me up from school. The kids would always tease me when he'd roll around that bend in the country hills with his rusty old work truck. And they'd say, "Why do you live with your grandpa? Your grandpa's here." And I would always get angry and say, "No, that's my dad." And they'd say, "Why doesn't your grandpa get a new truck?" Other teasing. But that was him. He was totally unpretentious, totally disinterested in the sort of pretty accoutrements that are so fashionable then and now. He didn't spend what he didn't have, and he didn't buy what he didn't need, and he never chased what was unimportant. In a culture dazzled by material success and shiny possessions, he was a man out of season, but at once he was always at one with himself. He was never driven by greed or envy. He was driven by an inner love, an energy. Work wasn't a means to an end, as you can see in that video. Work was, to him, a sort of end unto itself. But I couldn't understand that. I couldn't understand that at all at the time. He was this embodiment of sage wisdom and rugged self-reliance. I just didn't get it. But I do now, at least partially. I drove a 1995 Honda Civic to these services today with 200,000 miles on it. My dad really loves that car. I could almost hear my humble father right now. He'd be looking down on us, and he'd be seeing us make a big fuss about his life. And I know he'd be thinking from heaven, trying to contain that sheepish smile that he would get sometimes. His hair would be, as now, forever long and perfect and blanched white. He's probably muttering what he said to me so many times, especially in the recent years, when he and I would get these discussions about foreign affairs or domestic politics, and I'd fly way off the rails in my passion and energy about it, and he'd say, "Don't get carried away, Bob. Don't get carried away." He was simple and pragmatic and practical and grounded. That was Dad. So I'm not going to get carried away here today. I'm going to follow the advice from which I too often strayed from Dad. I too often strayed from it when we were living here in this earthly realm, moving in time and space. By the time of my birth, my dad was already well into his 5th decade of life. He traveled the world, he'd been tested by war, he'd raised 5 children before me. He was self-educated, and he was tempered by a childhood of urban poverty amidst the depths of the Great Depression, things that I would never know. And he had a certain sort of understated gravitas, and it comes with having walked the hardest of paths. His mother had died soon after he was born, as you saw in the video, and it was an event that informed his humanity, but he never talked about it. He never discussed it when I was a child. Later on, I'd have to sort of coax it out of him, and he would go into it a little bit. But it was something that was sort of a deep source of pain for him, and he didn't visit it very often. And reflecting on his life once again, I'm reminded of what he would tell me so many times. It was another shiny little pearl of wisdom that he would buff and mold and deliver in a slightly different form. And the first time I remember hearing it was when I was about 10 years old, and I'd begun playing Little League Baseball. I wasn't very good at first, not at all. And Dad would take me to practice out in the fields, or he would take me to the batting cage. He was an old man by this time, and he moved with a sort of creaky gait, and he managed a stiff sort of leg kick and that sidearm delivery to throw me the batting practice. And he'd hurl pitch after pitch, really slow, pretty erratic, and I'd hit a few and I'd miss a whole bunch of them, and then the game would come by, usually on the weekends, and it'd be worse. I'd draw some walks, and I'd strike out a lot, and I didn't really put it in play very often. And I was pretty dejected, and I'd always say to Dad, I want to quit. I just can't play this game anymore. It's really embarrassing. And he'd look at me with that sort of quizzical expression that he had. He'd say, "You just got to keep trying. Just keep trying at it. Do the best you can." That was it. Dad wasn't given to lofty philosophical expositions or stirring speeches. He was generally a reticent guy, the kind who you would think was aloof or didn't like you because he had this sort of gruff, one-word answer exterior. He always spoke plainly and simply. He had an economy of language that befitted a man who, up until his last days, as my mom would attest to, would still stoop down and pick up a dull nickel or a car part that had fallen off a passing vehicle. He did his best. And that struck a chord, maybe not immediately, but it was a chord that would get to me and would steadily reverberate through our too short time together on Earth. And that Little League season turned around for me soon after that. He would ferry me to practice in the batting cages, and I'd plug away, and I'd get a little better. And that was great. And it wasn't all he taught me, but it was an overarching message that he imparted to me, and I think to all of the grandchildren, everyone else that he took in as a child over the years. Do the best you can. Do the best you can. There were other pieces of advice, a lot of them now sort of embossed in my memory, like shooting stars that never fade, tinted with love and illuminated with that wisdom that he had earned, so hard earned. Money makes money, he'd say. Always save your money, Bob. Always do what you're going to do. Do what you say you're going to do. Never go back on your word. As Chris had mentioned before, get your education. Get your education, Bob. No matter what happens in your life, your education is something that can never be taken from you. It's often said that you can take the measure of a man or a woman by how they react to adversity. And over the past few years, I've been in consistent awe of my dad's dignified, steely courage as old age and these diseases have really racked his body. His body was racked with cancer, and he popped these nitroglycerin pills like they were candy, threw them in his mouth, and they would They would ease the vessels in his tired heart, restore the blood flow. He was really addled with unbearable back pain all the time. He was getting more and more hunched. Yet he always kept up a brave face. He didn't complain. He was so tough. And he would play with and he'd talk to all the gaggles of grandchildren and now great-grandchildren who were coming to the house. And they'd come to visit him, and he would always be with them and want to know what they were doing. He talked about the future, even right up to the end. He would even talk to my wife and I, and he still held out hope that he would come up to Berkeley and visit us. He was still ready to do it. He never quite got there. He even increased his shopping and his dining activities with my mom. It was almost like he could sort of see the curtain of life descending, and he wanted to squeeze in a few more acts. And he still worked, as you saw in the video from that whole Pomona episode. That was really, really great. And I remember when I decided to use some time to help fix that little house, I assumed I'd just be out there by myself or with my wife and we'd be getting it done, but no. He insisted on always coming out, always joining us. And there he was, every morning. He'd be at that job site. That was when he wasn't at the doctor's office getting more prescriptions and a side of really dour prognoses. He'd drive up in his little white truck and he'd be packed with the old tools and we'd go to work. By this point, he couldn't sweep, as you saw there, he couldn't sweep more than a few strokes without getting out of breath and taking a break. And he'd sort of contort his creaky body, whether it was in the bathtub or somewhere else, to get at a faucet or a light socket, and then you could sort of hear that faint groan and that snap, crackle, pop as he kind of unfurled his body back upward. One time we were outside of the house and he said, "You know, Bob, I'm old and sick." I forget really what prompted it, but he said, "I'm old and sick." And he had his, at that point he had his sort of long sun-splotched fingers wrapped around that nitroglycerin bottle again. He was getting a pill. He had to take it real quick because he got these really bad pains in his chest. And I tried to lighten the mood, and I said, "Well, Dad," and I was chuckling a little bit, and I said, "You got to do the best you can with what you got, right?" And he didn't share that laugh with me, actually. It came from the right place, but it didn't really work. But he just kept staring at the side of that building, that old weather-beaten building that we were working on. And that was it. And not long after that day, Dad would be at home with us. Just recently, he again had defied all those expectations and living as long as he did. My wife and my mother and my sister and scores of other loved ones that I couldn't, or too numerous to count, they all came and we kept a vigil over Dad 24 hours a day in the hospital and then again at home. Because home he came, he did one last time. He always held out hope that he would get there. And he came home, but this time, unfortunately, he was rolled in on a bed as opposed to striding through the door like he'd done thousands of times before. His mind was still strong at the end, and my mother and sister always marveled at that. It was his body that had failed him. And he could, at this point, it was his last few days, and he couldn't hug us anymore. And he couldn't fix something for us, and he couldn't take us on a walk or take my mom to dinner. He couldn't pitch me batting practice like he used to. But he could receive our prayers, and he could open his eyes, and he would squeeze our hands, and he would tell us he loved us. In response, we'd be telling him that we loved him. He had to work up that energy to get those words out, but he did. It really shouldn't be a surprise now that I think about it, because, you see, he did the best that he could with what he had. And it wasn't much, but he squeezed every ounce out of it. And right up until that last breath, which he didn't even exhale until he had seen us with those loving eyes one more time the night before. His life's light had flickered for more than a week while we kept that bedside vigil. And then his spirit had left our earthly limits. And his body left the house that he had earned for us and our family 40 years ago. And he left it exactly the way that he would have wanted, with some loved ones at his side, my mom in the forefront, going outside, his body draped in an American flag. And now he's gone. And the question is, what are we all to do without him? What do we do without his love and his strength and his example? Well, I know what we can do. We can all, in everyone's life, with everyone that your families and your loved ones and all these extended groupings of beautiful people, we can all do our best with what we have. We can do it for ourselves. We can do it for you, Dad. We can do it for God. And just like you always said, Dad, we can do our best. That is all we can do. Thank you very much.